Okay, so um, I will just sorry about this. I'll repeat the preamble. That's just something. This is the benefit of having a really good assistant. You see, as an editor, they point out when you screw up. So anyway, hello and welcome to Irish Screen Editors. Talk about tasks, skills, and processes that an assistant editor working on TV drama and feature films would expect to deal with on a daily basis. Shane Woods will guide us through the many layers of an assistant editor's job, and he'll give us the great benefit of his extensive experience, including working on such shows as Peaky Blinders, The Crown, and many others. My name is Tony Cairns. I'm an editor. I'm specialising in TV drama the last few years, and I'm it's my pleasure to be your host and also to thank you on behalf of Irish Screen Editors. Again, if people can switch off their cameras, that would be great, please. Thank you. So Shane, tell us basically the day-to-day experience of an assistant editor in TV drama films.
Well, in some ways it's a fairly simple job, and in other ways it's a lot more complex, I think. But I think day to day I would define certainly assisting as basically like, in an ideal world, I want a situation where the only thing the editor is doing is editing. Now, very rarely do we get that ideal world, but as much as possible, that's kind of what my aim would be when I'm assisting an editor. So it's dealing with anything that's outside of that. In an ideal world, we want the editor to come in every morning and have the footage that's being shot for the previous day done, ready, all notes ready. It might involve dealing with producers, often dealing with musicians or visual effects people, post-production supervisors, or anyone basically outside that edit. So if you can do that, if you can be dealing with trailers or teasers, anything that can kind of give the editor and the director more time together, then I think that's kind of basically the day-to-day job that the assistant does. So from the beginning of the production, you kind of have more, when they're shooting, a lot of that is just dealing with the day-to-day, the footage that's coming in. And then towards the end, a lot of it's to do with basically making sure that everyone else has what they need and making sure there's a kind of good communication with the various people, the grade and the sound and all that when we finish.
Great. We'll get to that. The obviously that's the sort of tail end, the tail end of your talk about the finishing part and speaking to the people on the next stage. So before you start, before you get into things, before you what do you see as the assistant, what the assistant can do to make things start smoothly?
So I think it's often you're brought on, in my experience, brought on either by post-production supervisor. Often the editor is bringing you on board the project, sometimes line producer or someone like that. And I think the first thing that I'm trying to do is kind of introduce myself to the various people that I'll be dealing with. If you're brought on by the editor, you may have worked with the editor before. If you haven't worked with the editor, it's very important to kind of talk to them and figure out what they're expecting from you and what you need to, what you'll be needing, what they're expecting you to do. But I think talking to the other editors and making sure that everyone's on the same page early on before the production, like once you start shooting on most things, whether they're small or big, it's like an avalanche and you're kind of having to stay in front of it. So the more prepared you can be going into that, the better you're going to be able to deal with whatever's comes your way when that happens. I think there's figuring out a lot of it's, I think, about kind of figuring out what the expectations of the editor, the producers, everyone else is, and what you're able to deliver on. I think that's the kind of important part of the early process. One of the big things that you'll be doing is kind of talking about the workflow. Everything is very different. Like, every production is very different in terms of where that workflow lies. The stuff, it starts, say, with everything from camera. going all the way into the grade and into the sound, you know, you'll want to figure out, and you'll want to figure out what people are expecting you to do. So sometimes you'll have a DIT and even a lab producing stuff, producing footage, sometimes even syncing the footage for you. But sometimes you'll be doing that yourself. So kind of knowing what the expectations are of your needs, and also what the production kind of is looking for on a daily basis, but also moving forward, and whether you can manage that. So certainly on bigger productions, a lot of your job is figuring out, do I need support? Do I need some extra assistance in here? Am I able to deliver things on time to what the producers want? One thing I find very helpful early on is to try and introduce myself to people before the shoot starts. Mainly the two representatives that I feel you have on set are the script supervisor and the DIT. The DIT is the digital intermediary technician, I think. And their job is basically, their job usually is to take the color, to take everything that the camera department want to do, and kind of make that happen, and then get that footage to you. So introducing yourself to them ahead of time means that I've always think of them as my connection with the camera crew and the camera department. So if I have any issues during the shoot, I'm going to be talking to the DIT. If I feel, if we as the editor and the assistant feel that there's some focus issues, or if we maybe think that there's a technical issue with the camera, or something's coming to us too dark, or any of those worries that we might have, I would always love to kind of communicate that to the camera crew before we start going, involving producers or warning other people. So I think having a good reputation or having a good connection with the DIT is really important.
I agree, Shane, in a sense, because I always see the process of making drama is it's a relay race, and that you have to be able to be prepared, to have good communications, to be able to deal with the handover of material, of media, of documents, and any notes that you need to know in the edit room. But so it's a very good idea to establish that communication with the people who are going to be on set, and then they're your link to the cutting room, namely the script supervisor or some continuity person. They're sometimes the same thing, called it different, and a digital intermediary technician, or the DIT.
I'm going to be correct. Someone's going to correct me on that and say it's something different but anyway, but the DIT. But yeah, and I think the other thing as well I find is the first time you're going to call them during the shoot is usually when something has hit the fan, you know, and someone is worried about something, and, you know, something has happened, especially on a big production. So you don't want to be calling them with, there's a big problem, we need to fix it. It's always best the first call is like, hello, my name's Shane. We're going to be working together. And you know, it does help that if people think that they're, you know, on a big production like that, people can get kind of, especially you've got on set and post-production and they're out in the rain every day and you're sitting in an office watching telly, you know, it's then hard to complain about, you know, something that the camera's not doing. So it's always good to introduce and have a nice, pleasant conversation, because there will be so many conversations where you're trying to fix something and everyone's a bit stressed. So it's always good to have those conversations early on. The other person on set that I feel is really important is continuity, or the script supervisor. They're essentially you're linked to the director in a way, you know, and to a lot of the actors and to a lot of a sense of the mood. So again, communicating with them, introducing them to you as the editor, is an important part of their process, so that they're producing the kind of notes that you want to see as the editor, but also, you know, that there's a communication between us. If the directors, the really good script supervisors, you'll see if the director's worried about a scene, they can communicate back to the editor to maybe start on that scene in the morning, or to look at that scene, or to look at aspects of that scene, and they can really save your life. I have a really good story from one production I was on, where the script supervisor would kind of privately have a chat with the editor about what this, you know, what the things that the way that the director wanted the scene to be cut, and the scenes that they were more worried about. And halfway through so the editor would start that morning on the scenes that the director was most concerned about. Halfway through the production, the director turned to the script supervisor and said, I love my editor. It's like he knows what I'm thinking. So I think you know, that's the value of a really good script supervisor. And so, yeah, again, it's communicating with them ahead of time to make sure that they have everything they need.
And then it's obviously setting up the space for the workspace, and the dealing with the what the editor would probably be looking at as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's setting up, you know, whether it's, you know, making sure that that they have the technology, that, you know, the tech that they want, that the room is set up, that oftentimes you're inspecting their room. You know, do they want how do they want the desk set up? You don't want to be doing that on the run. So, you know, anything you can do to kind of set up the room and set up the project. I really like to you know, set up the project beforehand. I have myself have a sound effects library that I will try and get up and get ready, so that, you know, and that the project is set up for them. I like to, you know, if they're working on a shared partition, if the editors are working on a shared partition, setting up those drives ahead of time, setting up one for rushes and renders and music, and keeping those separately, and organizing those and setting that up. It's much easier to do ahead of time rather than once everything's running.
Yeah, we'll move on. You'll be giving us a demonstration of your the organization of the actual drive partitions and data spaces. But another it's always good to have a chat with the sound department as well ahead of time, if possible.
Yeah, I think so. And talking to the sound guys again, it's about as much about opening up lines of communication, that if they're concerned about something, that they can communicate that to you. I like to do very early on in the production, I like to do tests both for sound and grade. So, you know, having the sound person to say, is there anything you're concerned about or want to listen to? Is there hums or buzzes or anything that, you know, so you're getting those things to the post sound guys and testing that out. And again, the same with the DIT and the DOPs, like, is there anything you're concerned about? And you can check with the grade. So that's something that I do, yeah, early on in the project.
I was going to say, so I mean, we could. I mean, we're going to look at we're going to look at the just the different slating systems, or do you want to talk about the partitions next?
We can do with partitions. Yeah.
Let's move on to those. Yeah.
That's something, I mean, again, everything's different. You know, you've got to work with each project, but I find that on a shared storage system, but also if the, you know, editor's working on a standalone drive and you're doing that, that's even media management is much more important. So media management is going to be a really important part of any of any process, and the more you can be organized ahead of time, the better. I usually set up, yeah, for rushes. I like to keep the dailies and the rushes in their own partition. Then I'll like to try and aim other people towards, you know, any renders that the editor's doing or anyone's doing is going into one drive, and the same for music, because I think nowadays, especially, people are moving, people are working remotely, people are often taking drives with them. So the more kind of on top of that stuff you can be, the better. I don't think, was there anything else we were going to discuss on that? Little things like getting ahead on title cards, watermarking.
Yeah, but also like project settings and creating folders for the projects, and the importance of having those things in place before the actual cutting starts, so that you have and also that this is talking to the editor about their layouts, their bin layouts and stuff like that.
Yeah, we can talk about, yeah, bin layouts is something. I'm going to share the screen, and then I'm going to share this document to just kind of discuss various each editor kind of works their own way. And again, early on in the project, it's as much about figuring out what way the editor is going to want to work, and then what way each editor is going to want to work, and how to set up the project best for them. A lot of editors will work, when they're getting their dailies each day, are going to be getting it in this tile view that we see on the left. This is a kind of a short film that I did. So this is a kind of simple tile view here on the left of the screen. So you have like each slate separated and then kind of previewed, so that the editor kind of has an easy visual layout for how they view their bin. And then again, when we get down to this, is a more, on the left is a much more complex version where we've got groups. So they can see in this version, you can see on the left of the screen, you have left and, A camera, B camera, and then the group A camera, B camera group. And again, for those editors, I think it's a way of being quickly able to visualize the coverage that they have. On the right of the screen, this is how Tony likes to work, which is to set up on text view. And do you want to explain a little bit about why you enjoy working in this?
Yeah, it's basically because I kind of it just it makes I can see at a glance the details and text, and for me, I remember the visual aspect in my head of each setup, and the description there would say the top says WS Jenny and Judge. That's wide shot Jenny and Judge, and then it's a shot description there is kind of a shorthand for me to, oh, I know what that shot is. So I find the tile view, the pictures with the small thumbnails, to be really it's, to me personally, it's confusing, because you can't really see the whole shot, whereas I can do a line and a description. I can also see straight away how long the take is, so I have an idea about how much, the duration is important for me to understand how much I've got from that take, or that scene. And I use colors to separate the setup, so I know each color represents a different camera setup. So I can see at a glance. So it's just as you may have said, it's a personal thing. That's my preference as an editor, which I would communicate to the assistant, to say this is how I like things, to be set up. And now it's something that I don't mind doing myself as well. I'm fairly hands on, and I have maybe my own peculiar kind of little language that I use to describe shots. But so I usually say to the assistant, just create the column with the slate information, scene and slate information, and then the duration, and leave the rest for me. I'll go when I'm going through the rushes, when I'm logging them myself, I'll add the descriptions. So it keeps as simple as that. But it does look less interesting than a load of pictures. I do give you that.
Well, it's to each. I mean, in the end of the day, it's the way that's going to best serve the production and the editor, the director, whoever's working on it. And with that stuff, there's often quite an overlap in terms of, some editors will want you to do all of the descriptions and all of the detail. Other editors want to do that. That's part of their process. So it's very much about finding the best version of that can, that's going to help them. Some editors I know will want, some editors I've dealt with will want at the beginning of the day a massive timeline of everything that's been shot that day in the order that it's been shot, and they'll sit there and watch it, and they won't need their scene bins until afterwards. I think what I will always try to aim for, as in terms of expectations, is I'm trying to set up a project whereby the editor can come in and open up what was shot the previous day. That's not always going to happen. There's so many factors that come into play in terms of, sometimes they'll want to split the rushes. Sometimes you'll have extra tasks to do, like you'll have to be sending out the dailies to producers, executive producers, various different people. So depending on the task you do, you can't do that. But I think that's the starting point that I want to work from. And then I try to, again, it's about dealing with the expectations of production money, how much money they have, how many people are involved, how long things take. You kind of have to factor all of those things in when you're making that decision. But ideally, I would love, you to get in as the editor in the morning and just have your bins with your footage waiting for you.
That's something that I appreciate. So we in terms of the folders, obviously when you create the folder, and just to sort of for a note for everybody, this applies to any non-linear editing system, but Avid Media Composer is the kind of the standard in terms of TV editing, drama editing, and feature films. It's the go-to one. So there may be Avid specific terms, but in your talk about like in the project, you'd create folders, and it's good to have everything divided in clearly so that both yourself and the editor can see where things are. So you've got a list here of where you say cuts, scenes, sound effects.
Yeah, I don't know if I did a preview of that.
I don't think you did. If you can go back at the full screen, we can. Yeah, I'm not sure you did.
I don't think I did. I think I did one for the daily. Oh, do we have it here? We have
Yeah,
some
we
of
do.
them.
Yeah. We have something there
Yeah.
on the left. You've got an idea of the.
So here's an example of this is towards the end, obviously, when it's a little bit more. But I think in an ideal, ideal world, you especially when you're on a bigger project, like being tidy is just something that becomes absolutely necessary. So as in a perfect world, you don't want bins that are sitting outside outside of the main folders. As you can see, there are a few. So you try to organize it like that. Here we had at the top, you can see locked cuts. And again, I try to have a naming system that works very, where the most important things for the editor are at the top, and then down towards the end are left. So those rushes are kind of in the middle. You have scene bins separated somewhere there, and then the cuts are at the top. So again, all of this stuff, the more organized you can be, the better for everyone, going forward.
Especially on something like episodic TV series where you would have two editors, maybe three, working on a show. So you're sharing a lot of, and there's being able to find things as efficiently as possible is key. And I'm just going to say for our audience there, you can see on the left, each of those are folders that contain subfolders, which contain bins, and you see on the right there, you can see the breakdown where they contain the relevant bins which contain the clips or the sequences that are being used in the project. And as like a large scale project, like a high end TV thing, you really have to have a good system to be able to drill down and know where things are, especially if I imagine, Shane, as the assistant, you're constantly being asked for things on a kind of short notice basis.
Yeah, and there's things like, and I think I'll probably point it out when we get to, when we get to the rushes is that there's, you know, often cases where, you know, you'll have people running around, second unit running around shooting different things, or maybe even the director picking up something on the fly. So the ability to be able to say go through 150 days worth of rushes and find something that you might have missed, but also the director might have thought that he shot, but actually maybe they didn't, you know, being able to deal with stuff after the fact and check back at stuff to find whether they'd shot something or whether they missed something or any of those things, that the more you can have a system in place, the better that becomes in terms of you know, uh dealing with those and not having things that are time consuming down the line.
Exactly, yeah. And yeah, and then obviously the numbering system that's used is to give the hierarchy of the various folders that you would be going to, as you said, in terms of importance. I noticed obviously you there's one there that's sound effects number three, and I think you're. I mean, I can't underestimate the importance of having a really good sound effects collection to hand. So, if you wanted to have a quick chat, let us know about your views on that.
Well, it's something that I you know, I realized that at the end of every production, there was a certain amount of sound effects that I had. And I think after a while, I kind of realized that maybe I got a bit fed up of going to YouTube and finding the same Atmos clock sounds kind of every time I was on a production or whatever it was, room tone. So I started building my own collection a number of years back and have kind of built it up over time. And then I try to install it every time I'm at the start of a production, is just install that. So it means, especially nowadays, for those who are Avid users for a couple of years will remember that finding and searching Avid bins for sound effects was not really the best for a couple of years, not to be too critical of Avid. And their find tools have improved a lot since. So I've started with a really organized sound effects bin, but it's gotten better over time that I can now search them. So it means it just saves me time down the line to be able to, one, the editor, if they want, can search for them themselves. There'll be plenty of times where you're in with a director or you're you know, in on the job where you'll need that sound effect quickly, and you have the ability for you as the editor to be able to get that quickly is great. And but also then for the more in-depth stuff, especially down the line, there may come times where you need to do a pass on a scene where, you know, you mightn't have the time to do an in-depth sound work on a scene, so you might be passing that on to me. So the more that I have available to me, the better. And I think the last couple of years I've been experimenting a little bit with, you know, 5.1 and kind of bigger soundscapes and stuff as well. So having examples of those and atmospheres and stuff that you've built yourself kind of really helps you do your job day to day, as opposed to you having to find them every time.
Yeah, exactly. That's why I'd say advice for anybody is starting out is to try and gather and cultivate your own library as well. I mean, it's an interesting point, Shane, because I've often asked the assistant to help out by doing some track laying and finding sound, and particularly on a busy sequence, so I can concentrate on the picture editing. There, the assistant would go and find various audio elements, sound effects or drones or stuff to try and to put in, and then I can then obviously refine. But it does help speed up the process, because a lot of these things that you're working to tight deadlines. So
Mm-hmm.
I mean that would be the kind of the general layout of the project and what you do to prep for the edit. I think we can maybe have a quick look about it's a kind of an ongoing thing nowadays, because there's a lot more co-productions between American and European um, entities,
Mm-hmm.
broadcasters and streamers. Can we just have a quick chat about the different slates that you would expect to see, and what the information is there on each, the difference and the what's on them?
Yeah. So the two systems in terms of slating that exists is the European slating system and the American slating system. The European slating system is essentially chronologically how you shoot. So on the first day, you're shooting take 1, 2, 3, 4, and you're moving forward from there. I think the advantages
So that's
of
so you're saying is you sorry, Shane, you're saying you're starting from slate 1001.
you're starting from slate 001 and take 1, take 2, take 3, and then slate 2 and slate 3, and so on. So you're chronologically, it's obviously the advantages of it are that you are moving chronologically, so you need to do less organizing in a sense. You don't need as much attention to detail because it makes sense that 1 follows 2, follows 3, follows 4, and so on. I guess the disadvantage can come, I think, when you start moving to scale. When you start a production moving to scale, sometimes you'll have more than one crew at the same time. You'll have a second unit, or sometimes you'll have 2 main units and multiple second units. So the idea at that stage of having something whereby they're following each other, you start getting duplicates in those cases. So that would be maybe some of the disadvantages of working with the European system. This is a European board here with kind of the detail of what you would see on a European board. So you have here, this is slate number 224, so it's the 224th shot that they've shot, and then the take, obviously here you can see in these cameras, it's a multiple camera setup. So you've got an A and B camera, and this board, you can see from this that on this board they're shooting both. The slate is covering both cameras, and then episode and scene is kind of referenced there in the corner, and then the camera roll is kind of referenced. So a good board is always good kind of help for if there's any kind of detail that you need.
Just to sort of help on this episode and scene, the way it works is the 3, and it says 314 there. That's episode 3, scene 14. So that, and then the camera roll is literally the number of the camera, the data card that's been taken off the camera. So by that stage in the production, that's 39 camera cards have been taken out, and then copied across, and then recycled, reformatted. So and everything else is fairly is pretty and the numbers in red is my bank account.
Yeah, Tony's phone number, please don't call. So that would be, and obviously what most people will do on most productions nowadays, they shoot what's called time of day time code. So they will shoot essentially the clock of the day, which means that in theory your audio is recording the same time code as your video. That's not always the case, and it's definitely part of the process that you need to check that stuff, but in generally that's, you are recording separate audio from video. The vast majority of times it's not being combined on set, so you will have to kind of sync that afterwards, which is very much part of the process. And these boards, of course, are boards where you can see the time code readout that everyone should be working off, but again, you should never assume that it is always in sync.
Okay, so the American system is very different, and I will say it's kind of taken on with a degree of grumbling this side of the pond, because obviously it's a lack of familiarity, and for some people see it as that it's unnecessarily, it's more complicated. But I think you're a fan, Shane, aren't you?
I'm a fan, but I know editors that hate it, and I also know editors that hate the European system and don't understand that. It's definitely harder to read, and I'm gonna try and explain it to people. So I apologize in advance if it does cause confusion. So the way that the American system works is that each scene is kind of a separate entity, and each scene is referenced in the slating. of is referenced in the slating. So rather than take slate 1, slate 2, slate 3, slate 4, we have the scene, in this case scene 8, and then you start, and this is the most confusing part, you start with 8 take 1, 8 take 2, 8 take 3. The next slate, so the second slate for each scene, is A. So it will be, you will have an A afterwards. So in this case, 8 stands for the scene, and A means that it is the second slate for that scene.
It's when it means slate, to explain,
Yeah.
it means each slate refers to a separate and different camera setup. So
Yeah.
each time the camera's moved or changed, then that becomes a new slate. So in the European system, it's a new slate number, and in this case, it's an additional letter.
Combination of scene number and the letter. So it starts with nothing, which is very confusing. Then it goes to A, B, C, D, and so on. The advantage of this system, if Tony, although Tony may disagree, the advantage of this system from a perspective, especially of bigger productions, is that you can have multiple units shooting. You know that you're going to get it, they will take up where they left off. So on bigger shoots, you will often split. You won't necessarily be shooting the full scene in a day. You might be shooting the full scene over 3-month periods with 3 or 4 different units who don't really who haven't really communicated. And so each time you return to that scene, you will take up where that scene left off. So if that scene was, if scene 8 had gotten as far as 8D, then the next time that someone picks up from that and shoots a shot for that scene, they will call it 8E. Obviously, you need to be very organized to do this, because if you, anytime that organization goes out the window, this system really kind of falls over. And it's very hard as an assistant, if you don't have proper notes, to be able to track whether you're missing something in this system if you don't have good notes. So that's the disadvantage of this system. But on bigger productions, especially ones where you have multiple units shooting in different locations, and you have scenes which are being shot very different times of in the production, this is a better way to work.
Interested. Jessica's just put a little note saying that it seems Germany uses the European American slating system. We call it the European system because we're Irish and we don't like to credit it as the British system.
Yeah. Well, I definitely don't want to call it the UK system, but
yeah, it's a cultural thing. So anyway,
yeah.
explain that. Now we can move swiftly along and just say you've got a little thing about a small thing about, well, important thing about early tests for grade and sound, and about maybe we can come off the screen share here, and you could talk about just the importance of doing tests, grades, and sound, and talking to and checking workflows and specs.
Yeah, I think it's good. It's good early on to communicate with your post people anyway. I mean, sometimes it can be at this stage, even on some productions, you'll be a year before you're going to be talking to these people. I think it's really important part of your job to just, first of all, to introduce yourself to everyone, to kind of have everyone talking. And secondly, to make sure that the system that you've put in place is going to work for everyone. And getting that locked in early on is really important, because what you don't want to come to the end of the production and find that something isn't working, that there's metadata, or that there's a certain spec that hasn't been hit. So for me, it's important to try and pick sometimes it's a scene or a section of a scene, so other times it's just a number of shots from the early days of the production. And what I'll try and do is try and find some really good shots, some shots which are going to look really nice, but also sorry. Yeah. Yes. Sorry. Apologies. So it's also good to to do stuff that might maybe a bit dark in terms of camera stuff, and in terms of stuff that might need a bit of work, or just that someone might be a bit concerned about. So communicating with the DIS and the camera crew as to what they'd like to look at is always a good thing as well. So there's a kind of feeling that everyone's on the same page with stuff that they're worried about. And the same with sound, to make sure that anything that the sound guys are worried about.
So the thing is, the biggest thing, first thing is for an assistant is getting the rushes, which are usually these days are downloaded from a central source, uploaded by the DIT or the lab or the whoever's handling the footage, and then you get sent you get the images, the video clips, and the sound, usually usually separate. And so your first thing to do, I suppose, is first thing you do is check the documentation, like, and then maybe you can look at examples of the documentation you're talking about, like the call sheets and progress reports, to see what was done, what was planned for that previous day, and what was actually shot. And then we can move on to you can talk about then the process of syncing the rushes and putting them into the relevant bins to be ready for the editor to start working on.
Yeah. Yeah. So let me just go back to the document. So yeah, I mean, it's always good to kind of understand how to read call sheets and schedules and stuff. It's not something that you'll need as much as if you're on set, but it's it's always a good habit to get into, to check what's going to be shot ahead of time. There's often things you're going to be interacting with, screens that you might be using, reference that someone might need, especially if there's pickups of a scene, or you've shot some of the scene and you need reference for that. So it's always good to be kind of ahead of yourself and to kind of understand how to read a call sheet. I mean, this is just an example with the scenes that are being shot the following day. The other thing that's always good to kind of keep on and ahead of time is is the schedule. Yeah, just one little thing that I point out that always confuses me is they have the day at the end rather than the beginning. That's always
confuses the hell out of me too.
good.
Just so yeah, because you think, oh, hang on, that's Anyway,
We're shooting that on Tuesday.
Tuesday. Yeah. Hang on, you get over it. It's sometimes we can be pretty addled in the morning, but we're grand by after the first coffee. This is, just so everybody knows, this who hasn't seen it, this is what's called a one-line production schedule. So it's a line per scene. So you've got the day, and then it says end of shooting, and then the number of pages which is the pages of the script that it plans to cover. So that gives you, as Shane says, an overview of what's coming up. And for instance, you could be pre-warned. My project I'm starting tomorrow, I had a quick look, and there's 2 days in a couple of weeks' time where they're shooting shooting 2 units with full days. So by looking at that, we're forewarned that there's going to be a hell of a lot of material coming in, because there's two camera units, 2 directors working separately at the same time. So that means a lot more. So we're ready for that. So and the other document you saw before was what's called the call sheet. If you put that back up there, Shane. Yeah, thank you. It's where that's for the sense of the crew, sort of to say call time, location, who's performing, who's the actors, and what's all the various materials, personnel and materials for the set, for the shoot. But it's useful for us in that, as Shane says, it gives you it gives you a heads up onto what they were planning to shoot.
Yeah. So yeah, and I think there's one thing actually that I find with especially, say, because obviously we shoot majoritively out, most productions shoot out of order. And I think, is it something that you find, like, knowing if, if, especially if you've got a bridging scene coming up, or if you're shooting, say, a big interview which is going to be intercut with other scenes, it's always, it's good part of the process in terms of knowing, say, if you have the scene that's going to be between this scene and another scene, and it's coming up the following day, that is good to kind of inform to you as an editor, because knowing that you've got a few scenes that can line up is can be helpful. So knowing when you have the next scene or the scene before that, if it's coming up, can often be a helpful part of your day to be aware of that stuff.
That's true. That's absolutely true, and it helps to kind of organize in one's head, at least in my experience, how to approach shooting editing scenes that are shot separately and they're shot kind of in as you said, a random order, so that you're kind of already preparing for the earliest opportunity to do a flow of scenes. And some scenes are shot. One scene is shot at the beginning. The next scene that's in the script could be shot near the end. But then sometimes you get, so knowing that you've got a sequence of scenes coming up is very, very useful. And I think the other thing as well, that the other document you would be looking at would be the progress report, which is also very important.
Yeah, so this is very much part of your daily routine, is knowing what this dealing with this document. The progress report is kind of the first port of call in the morning. This is essentially saying, everything that's supposed to have been shot, and then what they actually shot, and what progress those scenes are. So you can see at the top of this document here that there were a certain amount of scenes scheduled to be shot that day. And then below that, you have the completed scenes, part scenes, and not shot. So completed scenes are scenes in which they shot everything that they needed to shoot or planned to shoot for that scene. Part scenes are where they didn't. Now, that may be that they need to put more screens in, or maybe they need to do a close-up of a phone, but it might also be that they've only shot some of the part of dialogue, and maybe they're going to shoot the second, the later, or the following day, or whatever. And again, not shot today is just good to know that a scene was planned to be shot and didn't get shot. I think I find it an important part of my job to know which scenes are completed, and a lot of editors will want to know on their scene bins if this is everything that the director intended to shoot
Absolutely.
for that scene.
Because you don't want to be plowing into something figuring that's everything, and then you're going, hang on, there's something missing. So it's good to have that highlighted before you start.
And
As
again, if a scene is a part scene, often the progress, obviously on this day, everything was completed. But if or there's one scene that's part scene, but if it's often written in the progress report what is still missing. So if the script supervisor is good, they're giving a good description of what's missing. So again, that could be a choice that the editor makes, that maybe they don't want to. If there's too much missing, the editor mightn't want to start getting in depth cutting that scene. If there's only a little bit missing, the editor can probably cut the scene knowing that there's a close-up of a phone or something else to be dropped in. So these are important decisions to be made. And it's also, I think, this is an interesting part of the assembly process, or the process that you're going through while you're shooting, that it's your job as the editor not just to cut the scene with what you have, but to maybe communicate with the director whether maybe they need to shoot something else, or if there is more needed to be shot, or whether that's part of your discussion with the director, correct?
Yeah, yeah. Sometimes, well, it's what happens is you look at knowing if the scene's completed, for instance, and then you're looking at it, and you go, "Well, actually, they need we need to get another shot in here because it's missing vital information." And that so you can then highlight that by saying we need a pickup, which is not the it's generally not what production wants to hear, because that means extra time, and but they have there's always a contingency in the production for any pickups that are needed. And the balance is to make sure you're not asking for too much. Like, you don't want to be um too literal, or too but there's certain times where you say we need to see what's on that phone, for instance. That's the one thing that comes up a lot, is mobile smartphones or mobile phones, where there's a text, and and they're looking at it and then react, and then, well, actually, maybe we need to see what that text says, you know. Um, Plus, the other thing as well is that the editor can send performance notes about if there's a particular actor or extra or small, that they have something they need to kind of keep an eye on. That's something that can come from seeing the first cut. So having as much information in terms of the for the editor is crucial to be able to know you can make those decisions, because you don't want to make an embarrassing call for a pickup that they're actually going to shoot anyway.
Yes.
That's a bit of a redner, That's something you don't want to happen. Oh,
And,
sorry,
and
so
this, yeah, and this is a small example of like where good continuity and script supervisor notes can really make you look good as well, and where bad, and if they're not as good, and those can definitely be, can cause embarrassing situations. The other thing on this list is the timings for those scenes. So when a script supervisor comes on board, they make timings to see how long they reckon the script says that scene should be. When they shoot the scene, they then try and give an estimate of how long they think that scene played on the day, whether the actors were doing a faster performance or a slower performance or whatever. They make an estimate for that. It's an interesting thing. We were discussing this actually earlier, how useful it is to an editor each day to day. I think in the past, a lot of television was very specifically had to be delivered on time, and so getting these scenes on time and getting everything in the full episode to hit certain time limits and hit certain ad breaks and all of this was, I think, more important, slightly more. It's certainly slightly different circumstances nowadays, but it is important to keep an eye on this. And do you find this in terms of
yeah,
keeping
no,
an
it
eye
is.
on?
It's something that comes up. It comes up in my experience, it comes up in two ways. One is anxiety once the sort of shoots over halfway through, when they think they've shot too much or they're thinking they haven't shot enough based on the timings. I'm usually quite relaxed because, well, it is what it is. And the rule of thumb is that you know, they will the first cuts will of each episode or piece will be over length anyway, and that the requirements are for a certain, they're not as strict as they used to be in term, because there is a requirement for timings to be fit within broadcasters, because they have schedules to fit into, um, such as the BBC or Channel 4 or RTE. They have things built in, such as there has to be within, there's a minimum and a maximum, and it's usually 3 or 4 minutes, so it's good leeway. If you go under that, obviously it's tricky, because you have to kind of pad it out. But it's usually you're working towards the minimum length or somewhere in the middle. Um, and then you have to place your ad breaks and do your timings that way. If you're doing anything for Netflix or Sony, for Disney Plus or Apple or whatever, for the streamers, then it's the length is what it will be, because they don't have to worry about schedules. It's the viewer choose the time when they look. So yeah, so you do have to keep an eye on. It is a good idea to keep an eye on the timings, but it's also, there is it's not an exact science either. It's sometimes I get asked, how long do you think it'll be? And I go, I've no idea really. I can't tell you till we get
Yeah.
there, you know?
Yeah, and I have worked on productions where they did need to shoot a bit more as well, down the line, because because they were doing it was very fast, so yeah, it's something that you definitely need to keep an eye on, and this is kind of one of the areas where this is where the information is found for
Now
that.
from my point of view, obviously the editor's log is the next key document that which the continuity stroke script person or script supervisor to the same person would provide.
Mm-hmm. That's here. And yeah, I mean, this is essentially, generally, I mean, come in various different sizes, but this is essentially a chronological list of what they shot that day, the order, what slates they shot, how many takes are on each slate, so how many times they went on each shot, and then it often includes selected takes, essentially the director's favorite takes. And on some productions as well, it occurs separate ones, which is selected takes to be shown to the executives or to be put in, to be sent out to executives. It gives camera rolls, it has day information, and it has a brief description of continuity, any continuity notes that were needed for that particular slate. This is important for the assistant because they will often have to mark up for the editors which are the selected takes, and sometimes you'll have to send that out as a quick time or to the various people. So knowing, this is important information. I always think of this document as this is the definitive document. If the slates don't match this should be what you're going by. So I think it's an important part of the process, depending on the day and the shoot and where people were and whatever. This should be true. And if it's not true, I think it's an important thing to kind of check, because sometimes you can make a mistake. Script supervisor could think they stopped the camera when they didn't, or vice versa. So if this isn't absolutely matching the rushes, it's something that I will always investigate, because you never know if you're missing something, and this should be, so you should always be checking this and making sure that this is the correct document, and if it isn't, just investigating it. So that's
and I find it's very useful just to see. I can see there handheld, the top line says HHW handheld. I think that's handheld wide T-board run. It just gives you quick, as I said, the way I like to text my own layouts. You get a sense of what they shot to prepare you for getting stuck in. You were talking about slate pages and then script sync and line reads.
yeah. So this slate pages, again, this is generally delivered either a slate or a scene, depending on the script supervisor, how they like to work. This is just more detail. Again, some editors will be working off this. Other editors work off the editor's log. And again, a lot of this stuff is stuff you'll come back to, especially if there's visual effects or something down the line. There's information that people down the line will need. So organizing this and making sure these are on hand. And you can often organize, some editors will want them in binders next to the script so that they can kind of work. It depends on the editor. It depends on, and this particular script supervisor, she's the only person I know who's done this, but she used to draw the various camera angles and the setup from a top-down view on her pages, which was, I think the editor found that very interesting to know what coverage they had on various angles, especially say conversations or any of that stuff. So.
Well, it's very commendable, because the job of a continuity script supervisor person is extremely complicated, because they're trying to make sense of the sort of controlled chaos of the set. So that is a very commendable and very rare thing that they would do. And they also, one of the other things they supply is the scripts, the line scripts as well. Do you have an example?
Yep. I don't have an example of the line script, but I do have an example of script sync, kind of roughly. Script sync is quite a technical process currently. I think it's possibly going to get a little better maybe with some of this AI, new AI technology, but that's for another podcast. Again, the idea of a line script or script sync is essentially you have the script, and then next to it you have the shots and the coverage that those shots cover. So I think especially when you start shooting multiple cameras, and especially when you've got a lot of coverage of everything, this can be really helpful. The script sync allows you to check each line read each version of each line from every take. I think the flip side of script sync is that it is time consuming. So it tends to be in larger productions where you've got a lot of assistants, because it can be time consuming. And also, like anything, if it's not fully organized, it's kind of almost not pointless, because if the editor doesn't know that they have everything available to them, it's not really going to be a massively helpful tool, certainly when you get into the fine cut.
I just got to say very quickly, Shane, sorry, that it would be, I mean, it does mean manually entering the script and checking it off the takes.
There's a certain amount of automation involved. It kind of, you generally sketch out roughly where that take covers, and then the program will find an individual line will kind of match each line up. So on this, for example, you can just pick any particular line and you can go through each take of that line. So similar to another thing that editors often do is what's called a line read, which is kind of the bane of every assistant's life, which is lining up each and every version of that line up. It's a process which is often used by editors during the fine cut when they're trying to find the absolute best read of each
I've used
line.
personally, I've used it very, very rarely because, and I've kind of done it myself, only because it's just really hard to it just feels really hard to differentiate between the performance of different different takes. So by putting them all together, you can actually see the difference. If you put it in the cut and then take it back out and put another one in, it just makes it easier. Generally, yeah, it is useful to know. It isn't useful to know the different line things, but I think it's personally, it's a lot of work to get that set up. While we're there, maybe we can you can let us know a slight sort of digression, but the different roles of it's not just you're not just one assistant. You can have productions where you have first assistant, a second, and a third, and how that. I mean, any thoughts about how that can break down in terms of roles and helping out?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, as with anything, there's no specific, exact role that any person has. But I think that, having the same way as you might have a DIT on a production who's doing the color work on set and maybe doing transcoding of the footage into a format that the editors can work with. Other productions, you might have a lab doing that. As a production gets bigger, there's different requirements that you might need. So you need more people, essentially. So on bigger productions and feature films, the first assistant can often not even be on an Avid that much. They can be more of a post-production supervisor or someone who is essentially managing the assistants and has a number of assistants and is managing them and not really sitting in an Avid on. So the first assistant tends to be, the first port of call. They're managing the whole thing. They're often dealing with a lot of the producers or sometimes the directors. They're trying to basically like take a lot of the admin off of the editor.
Yeah, I'd say very quickly, and in a sense, it's the level of experience denotes the ranking, as it were. So, in other words, if you're a third assistant editor, you're kind of would be less experienced. Second is more experienced, and the first is, and especially on a big scale, like say for instance on The Crown or on those large, where there's a lot of things to take care of at the same time. It's about delegating tasks and levels of responsibility. So like the third would be you'd have would be maybe trainee or slightly more experienced.
Yeah, and the trainee. I mean, it changes on The Crown, for example. They tend to have a series assistant who is the assistant for the whole series, and each block or episode or two will have its own block assistant and then a second assistant and a trainee assistant. The reason for that is, first of all, The Crown tends to shoot 2 units at the same time, so it is always shooting at least two directors shooting at the same time, completely different episodes. So you're getting that footage in each day. It also, the way that it works is it only has one or two editors per block. So you often have 5 to 10 editors working at the same time, and each assistant is working to that. So the nature of the way they shoot, they have one person running one episode or two episodes together, a block as it's called, and then a couple of other assistants to help out at various different things. So it's about the scale and the speed at which often a lot of these productions have the bigger productions as well have set dates that they need to deliver on. That it's quite tight. So there's a lot more. There's a lot, in some ways, a shorter time for the editors. So a lot more will need to be done on, say, sound work, or you might be doing a lot of visual effects. So there's a visual effects editor, obviously, who is someone who's essentially an editorial person who's doing a lot of the temporary visual effects, but also kind of communicating with the visual effects people, delivering stuff to them.
Yeah.
And doing that end of things. So
yeah. But the thing is also it's that it's sort of a it's a sort of it's a kind of a hierarchical stepping stone in terms of, you know. But on a big high end show, the role of a first assistant, all the assistants, is really, really important, because, as you say, they're providing the support role and making sure things run smoothly. And when you're a first assistant at that, and in those sort of shows, you're kind of it's a very extremely important, responsible position. And you're not, you know, so you're not the head of the department, but it is a big deal, and you do have to know what you're doing. So I was just going to say, and now we can maybe move on to the sort of more the beginning and the end of the process of of an episode, of the kind of nuts and bolts, data crunching and etc. of the assistant's work, which is starting with when you get the footage in with the separate sound and picture, you sync up and then get it ready for the editor, and then we could maybe move on to then talk about when the edit the episode or even the feature film is locked, that you then do what's called the turnovers.
Yeah. So just share again for the dailies. 1 second. So yeah, I mean, the thing about syncing is that in some ways it's the easiest job to do, syncing stuff, because it's all should be designed for you to do. But in other ways, you know, it becomes the day to day. So any way that I could teach you how to sync rushes, you're going to be on your first day of the job. This is probably what you're going to be doing, is syncing rushes and organizing those scene bins for editors. And there's no better way to learn how to do it than to do it for 150 days straight. So you'll learn more in that than I could ever teach you in any of these talks. But I think one thing that it's having a system that works, and having a system that everyone can read as well, especially when you have a bigger production with multiple people working on it. Anything that's kind of good, a good system will save you time, even if it takes a bit of time to set it up. So this is kind of a system that I work with. Again, you can see on the left, you've got all of the folders for those days, the block that was shooting. So in this case, it was block 1. Shoot day 86 we have here, and then the date of the shoot is always the folder name. And then in it, I have all of the stuff that came in that day for that. So we have an A camera, we have audio with B, C, we have an O camera, and then the dreaded iPhone down the bottom, everyone's favorite thing to sync up. And the system that I use for syncing, there are many systems. This is the system that I use, and I find very helpful is there's a function on Avid called auto sequence, which allows you to create a sequence using the time code of all the clips that you select. So I create what I call a daily sequence, which is top right, where I line up the A camera, line up the B camera, line up the C camera, and then line up all the audio and put them all in the same timeline. And I sync everything in that timeline. I find this really helpful because it gives me a sense of how the day went. It shows me if I'm missing something, if I'm missing a particular section of rushes or something like that. It's quite obvious in this, or if there's anything out of plumb, I can kind of see quite early on. And it gives you a sense of how the day went for the shoes, if they were rushed at the end of the day, when they went for lunch, all of these things that is helpful to kind of get a sense of where they were. I think one of the things that they do nowadays is they record a lot of audio. So you can get eight, sometimes 10, 16 tracks of audio coming in. And this is dependent on the editor. Some editors love to see all the audio in their clips, but when you're syncing these clips.
You mean, sorry, Shane, what you mean is that each track, each recording for each take, it's called recorded on polywav system, where they can record up 8 to whatever number of tracks on each so each audio clip can have it's not just 1 and 2, it can be up, they have the track for the 1 and 2 is usually the mix, and then a track for the boom mic, second boom mic for the radio mics on the number of actors. So yeah, as you say, you can talk, editors have different preferences, but 1 and 2 is usually, isn't it? 1 and 2 is the mix, so it's just, you can have a choice just to use 1 and 2.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes they'll just mix down to 1. Sometimes they'll mix to stereo 1 and 2. Sometimes you will actually, a popular working method at the moment is that all the radio mics will be mixed to 2 and all the booms will be mixed to 1. It is important to know it because, especially for the editor, to know how it's being prepped, because it affects how the audio plays and if they get phasing and stuff like that. Most editors, the general editing system is that the clip will have the 1 and 2 or the mixes, and then if the editor needs to access the other clips, you can match back to the original and kind of find the different audio as and when you need it. Generally, if you need to do kind of in-depth audio work, and the same for the post audio people, anyone doing the dialogue mix is definitely going to need access to all of the audio that was available. But in general, editors only really work with the mix.
That's true, because if I'm looking for clarity on a dialogue on a scene, I use the radio mic and I match back to the original multi-track. The other thing as well, all this information is in the daily sound reports. So that's what you get that, you refer back to if you're want to find out who's which track is which radio mic and whatever you.
Yeah, and nowadays a lot of that metadata comes through when you're importing these files, so you can actually access them from Avid bins as well, and that can be helpful, especially when you get down to that. If an editor is finding there's a lot of noise on a scene, they may ask you to kind of go through and find the best takes and do an audio pass on the scene as well, depending. Sometimes it's the editor doing it, sometimes you'll want to do it yourself. It depends on everyone's time. But yeah, I mean, I sync up through that, but there are various different methods of syncing the audio. The important part of the dailies process is that you're organizing all the stuff that you're checking against the continuity notes, that it matches. And if it isn't matching, then you're investigating. And then in this case, what I would do is, this is a separate project. On this project, we had a separate project for the rushes, which often happens on bigger productions. And in this case, I would keep the scenes for that day in the folder with all of the stuff, and then I would give those scenes to the editor in their scenes or scenes to cut folder as in a separate project, so that if anyone needed access to that scene, I could always check it by day, by the day it was shot in the assistance project. But also, if I want to check it by scene number, you can check the editor's project.
Very good. And then the next phase, then obviously that's when the edit starts, when the start doing the first cuts and the assemblies. You're working from those synced rushes. You will also presumably you will organize when you've got wild tracks, and whatever Atmos recordings that are done on set as well, and make them to hand. So then, you know, we get through. It's the big important thing is that the end of the process then is the cut's been locked, as in approved, and it's just ready to go on to the next stage, which is the mastering, the grading, color grading, sound mix. So you're then your role as an assistant is to then do what is called the turnovers, which is
Yep.
quite a complex business, and yeah.
Yeah, well, yeah, the turnovers. So when the episode finishes, as Tony said, it locks, and then you kind of have, you know, as you've said, it's the video will often be going for an online or a conform, and then a grade. You will often be sending, or maybe it's you, maybe it's a VFX editor, will be sending various shots to visual effects companies to be worked on, and then there's audio. In general, again, all of these things are dependent on the scale of the production that you're in, but in general, the way that the audio will be worked on is that there will be someone doing what's called dialogue, which essentially is working with the sync. For all intents and purposes, they're going to be working with the sync recorded stuff. Then there's a sound effects person who will be doing sound effects work, and then there will be various people in music, whether they be people who are licensing music tracks, or the composer will be either composing or adapting music, depending on whether you were lucky enough to kind of have him on board throughout the process of the edit. So, and dependent on the editor and how they work, you will get the sequence will be given to you. Some editors prefer to kind of separate out these layers. Say, for example, with the audio, let's start with the audio anyway. Some editors will keep the sync separate from sound effects and music, and other editors would prefer to work their own way. So a lot of the process will be about going through this sequence and organizing it. The ideal sequence that I like to create for a turnover is a kind of, there's no such thing as a perfect sequence for a turnover, but if I can get as much information into that timeline as possible, and if I can organize it the best way that I possibly can, then it makes everyone's life a little easier. So there's a definite time where you're just basically going through this timeline and separating out sound effects from sync sound and then music, and separating those out and delivering those to the audio people. The other one you can see on this timeline, what I've done is I have V1 and V2 are picture. So it's any of the main camera stuff. V3 is iPhone, stock or alt footage, GoPros, anything like that, anything which isn't one of the main cameras. This comes from, this is really helpful, having been an online editor in the distant past. These are the footage that is much more complicated, harder to track down, harder to sync up, all of these things. So separating out stuff that's going to be easy for the online editor or a conforming person from the stuff that's more complicated is a great part of the process. Sometimes nowadays, especially with speed ramps and speed changes, which are kind of the bane of every editor checking an online that exists, depending on how technical the editor is, you will often separate out now speed ramps so that they can be dealt with individually. So here we have VFX temp. So I like to separate out any of the shots which are going to VFX, and any of the temp work is on its own level. so that in a sense you know where they are. And then above it is VFX Final, which in this case is maybe temporary or early versions of the final VFX which have been worked in. I always separate captions out, because any on-screen captions, any text, anything that online editors might need to put up on the screen, I keep separate from anything that may be a direction from you, the editor. You might be putting up on screen ADR lines or instructions for the VFX. So I separate those out so that an online editor can quickly see where those exist. And also you can see and reference if anyone's asking you a question down the line. There's VFX numbers are above the letterboxing, and then ADR notes are essentially, again, notes from the editor. You may have an ADR line request, or you may have, you will often need to replace a piece of dialogue, either sometimes for performance, sometimes for, you will want to just add a new line in, and sometimes you're going to put that on screen.
I was going to explain. ADR stands for additional dialogue recording, which often comes up when it's a request to replace muffled or noisy. They have to re-record in a studio. Any a take that somebody, or that they may have fluffed the line, but it's the best performance, or you need to do an over-the-shoulder add a line for story clarity. So that's ADR is additional dialogue recording, and that's why it's obviously essential to have, as Shane says, to have a caption there to say what the line is, so that it's known and it's timed for that when the additional dialogue recording happens.
Yeah, and you'll often be, so I'll be constantly in contact with the audio people and checking stuff with them, especially on bigger productions where you're moving at a pace. This stuff is changing constantly, so there's a constant kind of toing and froing. The dialogue people will be checking the dialogue again to see if it's good enough, or if there's alts that are working. Those things are kind of constantly coming back and forward. You're constantly, oftentimes the ADR that the editor is giving you is a temporary line, which has been written by the editor and the director sitting together, and will need to be checked with the showrunner or the writers to make sure that it's the correct line. You can't be writing your own movie. So there's a lot of that, and this is why, to me, once we lock, I try to organize as much as possible everything in the timeline, and then that way it's almost like a master document for all of the various different people who are going to need stuff in the next stage. I mean, there's obviously a lot more stuff than that, but
yeah. But as I said earlier, it's a relay. Production is a relay race, and you have to. It's best to hand the baton over as efficiently as possible. I use that analogy all the time because, and that's why I would be as an editor, I would have a tidy timeline and keep everything um, in the right place, so not have things sound effects in random tracks just because it's handy. And I think it does, personally, I think it does a disservice, because it means that the assistant has to spend a lot of time or reorganizing that so that it's a clean passover, handover rather, of the project to the sound department, the various sound departments, and to the picture departments. So I feel very strongly about that. That it's actually, people should develop the habit of having a tidy, organized timeline. So in other words, for me, I would have all tracks 1 to 8, or maybe 10, would be what I call production sound, i.e.,
yeah.
sync, dialogue, and anything that was recorded on set, like wild tracks or Atmos recordings or whatever. And then 11 to 16 or to 18 would be sound effects, or maybe 20 up to 9. Yeah, and then 19 to, would be music. So, and you just try and keep everything in that organization, that demarcation.
Yeah.
You'll win friends, and you will make people's lives easier. And also, I think it's easier for me as an editor to work because I know where things are. Now, sometimes you have to kind of break that when you've got to say a very active, busy action sequence, and you need loads of sound effects. But you can work that out at that time. But generally, that's the sort of principle. And
And I think that there's a give and take. I mean, if the timeline you have is majoritively, good, you see here there's like 36. I wouldn't necessarily recommend. There'd be very few editors who want to work with 36. But like if Tony is giving me a timeline which is neat and tidy to begin with, and maybe there's one section where there's another 5 or 6 sound effects, but they're in the wrong section, you can add those extra. And this is where it's an advantage then to kind of expand and spend a little bit of time cleaning that up and tidying it up so that it is all together. Because in my experience, anytime you deliver something that is a little bit, and for various reasons you might deliver something sloppy, it might not necessarily be your own mistakes or whatever. But if you deliver something that's a little bit confusing, you're probably going to pay that time down the line explaining it to people or fixing it for someone. So, in my experience, if I can fight for an extra day, something like this takes a day, maybe even 2 or 3 to do turnovers. And managing people's, again, down that line, managing people's expectations and maybe even pushing it by a week or giving yourselves a couple of days with a sequence to tidy it up and fix it up for everyone and foresee any problems that they may be having from their perspective will pay for everyone down the line, will be a neater. But you don't always get that luxury. But when you can, it is definitely helpful.
Excellent. There's a question here from Jessica Rudolph asking, what does the naming of the TC tracks in the audio mean? Is that the frame rate? So I think it's the sort of the little dividers between.
So the way that and this is not one of my sequences. If I'm cutting, if I'm editing, I use 1 to 7. If I'm cutting myself, I use 1 to 7 as sync sound. Then I use 8 to 19 as sound effects, and then I have a music section, and then I have a VFX section or a sound effects section at the bottom. So when I'm cutting, I separate out. I use the TC tracks and I color code to separate out all those different sections so that I can see. So it's more just that's the setting of my timeline. It's still in place. So I use.
You're not mixing up audio frame rates, like this one says 24 FPS and the other says 25. It's just they're just
I,
they're
I,
just
I
visual.
literally just use it when I'm cutting myself
Yeah.
to
Help.
demarcate sound effects or production sound from sound effects.
Yeah, because no, I agree. I can see that because you could go cross-eyed looking at that. It's like so I don't think the numbers do actually mean anything. They're just like the section dividers, Jessica.
Yeah.
So it's maybe just there to confuse and terrify people at some
I
point.
mean, you've got to throw a few in, right?
Yeah. I usually I usually put in names of dead pop stars. Anyway,
Well, I remember from you what I remember from you specifically. I mean, I've never assisted on a drama, but we, in our past, I have assisted you. And what the thing that terrified me about Tony was Tony removed all of the keys from the screen. So as an assisting for Tony, you had to remember what all of the keys were on the keyboard.
keep you on your toes. Yeah. No,
Absolutely.
I have a lot of shortcuts. I was just going to say, if anybody, I think we're getting towards the end of our talk here, I think. And if anybody has any questions, please throw them into the chat, the meeting chat to everyone, and we can see if we can answer. But I think in terms of um, the kind of relationship between the career path, it's important. Being an assistant is an extremely important job, and it's not something to be kind of seen as a sort of a lesser thing. It's a really important part of the process that will or can lead to being being a full-time editor. Isn't that right, Shane?
Yeah, and I think when you the lines blur a little when you start getting to bigger productions as well, in terms of, the need sometimes for an assembly editor, or it goes from maybe cutting recaps, or helping out with teasers and trailers that the editor just doesn't have time to do, to assembling, which is if, especially on bigger productions where there's a lot of stuff, as Tony mentioned, sometimes multiple shoot days coming in, you need to tackle those in different ways. So having someone who's going to kind of come in and know the system of whether the editor is going to pick up from where you left off, or whether you're just doing it as a proofread of whether that footage works. Someone who's assembling, or an associate editor, which is tends to be an editor who kind of comes on and at the end, when the editor's maybe finished, but there might be a few little tweaks to be made during the grade, or kind of dropping and testing visual effects, all that kind of stuff. It does kind of run fluidly, eventually into editing, fine cutting yourself. I felt anyway.
Yeah, we can go full screen, I think,
Right.
Shane, 'cause that people be going cross-eyed looking at that, I think. Um, um, I was going to say very quickly, there's a question there from Shifra. Claire says, "Do you use Premiere Pro as well?" I'll sort of jump in first. Is in that I use Premiere and Avid, and I think it's actually important for editors to have to know one, not just to be dependent on one or the other. They're the two main in terms of production. Final Cut is there, but it's not as prevalent in terms of feature films or high end TV. Um, the As I said earlier in the talk, at the beginning of the talk, Avid is the kind of most common um, uh, non-linear editing system, and I think it's important if anybody's in college or in learning that they do learn the basics of Avid as well. It's good to know something else. It's good for your brain, but it's just it's very it's basically got the edge because it's more stable, and it's better designed for using for multiple users, such as VFX editors, assistants, a second assistant, third assistant, and other editors in the block. Isn't that the case? When you have you done any assisting on projects with Premiere?
Never premiere. I assisted. We started a production on Final Cut because particular production, because the director liked working editing and he knew Final Cut. We ended up having to move to Avid because it couldn't quite handle. This is a number of years ago, but it couldn't quite handle the amount that he was shooting. Yeah, again, I feel very much similar in terms of I don't have any particular human preference. I've never actually learned Premiere because I've never been asked on a project. And I always think if I learn something new, it generally pushes something old out of my brain. So I'd learn it if I would definitely learn it if I don't have any preference necessarily. I think also there's a thing in the industry, the film industry in general, of like they like what they know.
Hmm.
And I think Avid is something that people know and it's done by other productions. If you're going to be breaking that, or you're going to be proposing breaking that, you need to have a reason. So like, to explain to a producer that you want to use Premiere, as an assistant, you're going to need to make sure that you know that every single step of the way you can communicate with the people that you used to communicate with. There isn't an excuse to saying, oh, we don't want to deliver sound to the sound people the way they want because we're on Premiere and you can't do that. So if, as an assistant, if you're coming at that stuff, you need to make sure that you have answers to every question that someone has. You can't be saying, oh, we don't work with Pro Tools because we're on Premiere. So I think there's a production like what they like what they know works. And I think by and large people in the industry like what they know works, and they know how Avid
Yeah,
works, even though we can argue all day about the various flaws and
very
stuff.
fair. It's like a verb, like to Google, to it is to Avid. Like the Avid is in people outside of editorials kind of mind. So there is that, but it's also the infrastructure around editing in for films and high end TV is there's a lot more plugins and infrastructure that's suited to the Avid system than there is for and there's also Valeria just mentioned about DaVinci Resolve. I mean they're kind of I have never used DaVinci. I'd be interested in it. I'm always interested in new things, but there's a
Mhm.
sort of sense that you're dealing with a very highly a bit conservative, but also highly plugged in already to a using a particular setup that is the sort of the industry standard. So um, I mean, it'll change. I mean, Premiere.
Resolve is now industry standard, definitely for doing rushes and dailies. Even though it is possible to do it in Avid, I don't think I've done it in Avid in a number of years without giving away my age. But like it hasn't been done in Avid for a number of years. Resolve is where people definitely do all the rushes and rush. That's where the majority of kind of dits will work out of that.
The
Um,
transcoding. I mean
yeah,
transcoding from the
transcoding. Yeah,
master to the resolution. Yeah, the
yeah.
Avid
So
proxies.
So yeah, processing proxies or a lot of conforming and stuff like that. But I do know people, again, with all these things, I know people who use them. If you're an editor who is working on Premiere, you need to make sure that you know that that you can work within the system, because like the first time that you don't deliver something, they're going to want to blame Premiere, whether it's Premiere's fault or not, or whether there's a bet. There's no such thing in our industry of, I have dealt with certain people who have very old-fashioned ways of working that involve a lot of work for an assistant. You can't turn to them and say, well, there's a faster way of doing that, if they don't want to work that way.
Yeah.
So you can use these other systems, but if you want to, as an editor or as an assistant, use these other systems, you better make sure that you can do everything that everyone else requires of you.
I was going to ask one question, Shane, which is is there there's different system there's different isn't there different software that's available like Pluralize for syncing up? Is that something that you have come across, or would you recommend people getting to know if they're as they're considering going into the assistant editing? Is there any specific software packages that you think people shouldn't be proficient in?
I think everyone's different in different areas and various. I think one of the things that I would say is some assistants are not particularly technical but very organized. Other assistants are not particularly organized, very technical. Anything you can do, any tools you can use, and there's going to be a lot of stuff, some really interesting tools all the time, and toys that are coming out. Those, it's always good to use those uh things and know how those things work. And if you can work, again, if you can work within the system and it works, then absolutely you should be doing that. I use a lot of macros, and I have a program called Keyboard Maestro which creates a lot of macros. An example being those dailies folders that you see for each day with the same name. I have a macro that creates those in the morning, so I can come in, put a cup of coffee on, and just press return, and it will print out, make all of the folders for my day and my dailies. Little things like that can definitely, little tools. I know people who name clips, who you do a lot of naming through macros and programming. And I think you had a particular assistant who did a lot of programming on Bandersnatch. That was very helpful for you.
It was actually, it's an interesting story because that was it kind of chimes in with using a different system. I I I insisted that that when I was going to be editing Bandersnatch that we use Premiere rather than Avid, because Premiere, like in Final Cut, has the ability to be able to have multiple sequences open at once, whereas in Avid you can only have one edited sequence open at a time. So as people may know, Bandersnatch is an interactive Black Mirror film that. So I figured in advance that I would need to have a multiple number of sequences in to actually try and do a simulated playing from section to section based on whatever the interactive choice that we would be made. So and that proved to be an issue because we were using Premiere Pro on a higher system that was based around Avid with an Avid Nexus network storage system, and so it was. I did come out into the room, and my assistant John would be in a fetal position under the table, whimpering at the latest crash. But he was. It also turned out that he was aware, and it was actually very hard to find. There was very few people, assistants, who were available who would know Premiere as well as Avid, and John Weeks was one of them. And it turned out that he was actually a coder as well. So he actually ended up being able to code the this software that Netflix had developed to view interactive footage or material on a laptop. So actually, because it was actually my decision, made me look like I was very clever finding somebody who actually fulfilled a job we didn't know what they needed to do. So there you go. So that was my. But I use just so if I would use Premiere Pro on a standalone feature films, if I can, and because I like using Premiere Pro a lot, and it's if it's on something like where it's a low budget feature, it's actually, I find it, I really enjoy using it, and I like to use it. I like to change the headspace. It's what you mentioned it earlier, but you learn something new, you forget something old. I I'm kind of I'm it's a difficult experience looking at something and you're so used to using one non-linear editor, and then you have to use the other one. But that's good I think that's good for your brain. I was going to say, in terms of people who are in maybe in college or learning or whatever, is that certain things, like it's good to have knowledge of document formatting, um, Photoshop, maybe a
It's
little bit of After Effects, whatever, all these sort of ancillary things that it's kind of useful to, and Resolve, the VFX in Resolve, they're kind of useful if to have to hand, if the so the editor might say, and I had occasion to do this, say, I need you to do a quick comp here, but I don't have the time or the tools to do it, so as much as that can be learned, is always very useful. So here we are. It's now we're now an hour and 45 minutes in. I hope uh, hasn't been too taxing. I'm trying to think. Is there any questions you might ask Shane about, like, in terms of the editor sort of relationship that
um I
you
don't
could
have
improve?
I I don't have any on hand. It's I've dealt with a few in my time, so they come in all shapes and sizes. So but yeah, I think. Do you have any any other outstanding
I
queries?
don't. Yeah, I think about one thing I'd say very quickly. I think is just I really admire the level of knowledge that's required and its professionalism in terms of, particularly in terms of turnovers, about being able to have to know the requirements for the different departments and being able to deliver. And it's become much more complex. That you have to do like a lot of sound checking, and to make sure that the track lay is correct, and panning, going through depending on what's what's been requested by the sound mix people, or the dialogue editors or stuff like that. So I'm sure you must, it's a very complicated, and I have to say I just really admire that, and that it's something to be aware of, that that's what's required in, I suppose, again, we say that sort of the bigger scale, the higher end projects.
Yeah, I think someone said to me once when I worked in Windmill Lane, they said it's not necessarily about how good you are at the job, it's how good they think you are. And a lot of as much as we all went to art school and we want to make art, a lot of all of our jobs ends up being politics. And uh a lot of it, you may have a better technical solution than someone else, but oftentimes you have to, so a lot of it's about, again, that thing of kind of coming on board and managing expectations, whether it's the editor who wants all of the rushes in the bin at 11 a.m. and the producer who wants to deliver the second half of the rushes at the end of the week. You know, a lot of your job is going to be dealing with people and trying to keep everyone happy and trying to manage everyone's expectations of what's available, you know, what is needed that day. I mean, most of it is that, and that'll always come with experiences. And I think it's worth pointing out that no one is expecting you to know all of the stuff that we talked about today. No one is expecting you to come on the project in your first day as a trainee assistant editor with all of that stuff. They will train you, that, you know, you will do it. And as with the dailies, anything that's confusing, trust me, 150 days in a row of doing dailies, and you won't have any problem syncing and prepping stuff.
I think that's a great way to finish up, Shane. And I'd like to say a big thanks to you, and for giving us all that, you know, knowledge and wisdom and experience. I'd like to thank our colleague as well, Owen McGurk, who's been in the background. I was going to say very quickly, this recording will be available on the Irish Screen Editors website at some point, very shortly. If anybody wants to get a link, please send an email to info@irishscreeneditors.com. That's info@irishscreeneditors.com. And then when it's up, I will send you, just let you know. But I've got to say, it's great turnout and great to see there's a number of people from different places. I can gather there wasn't just Ireland, so thank you all for joining us, and I hope it's been very, very useful. And on that note, I think I would like to say I'm going to close the meeting and wish everybody a oh, by the way, and also thank you for all the thank yous. You're very kind, very good people. Give yourselves a round of applause. Actually,
and Tony, thank you for hosting. It's been very
tell you
good.
what we're going to do before we finish, right? Why don't everybody turn their cameras on, and we'll all have a look at you. All right, hello, Larry. I can look at you. Come on. Some of you are very shy. Some of you are very shy, but oh no, it's great to see you. Excellent. And
Thanks for coming.
thank you for giving up your valuable weekend time. And like I say, we'll have this online very, very, very shortly. Okay, so you can, if anybody came in late, we'll be able to pick up from the beginning. Thank you, everybody. Have a great Saturday.
Cheers.
I know.
Thanks. Bye.